This is the Content and AI podcast, episode number 6. Developing software has always been challenging. AI takes things to a whole new level. Kurt Cagle says the current pace of development in the generative AI world is like building a luxury hotel on top of quicksand in an earthquake zone. Kurt has reported on and participated in many eras of technology advancement, but he's never seen anything like this. His advice for thriving in uncertain times like these: stay nimble, pay attention to what's going on, and don't get tied to any one technology.
Welcome to the Content and AI podcast, where experts on artificial intelligence share their wisdom with the content community. Our mission is to demystify and democratize AI, to make its principles and practices accessible to all content practitioners. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 6 of the Content and AI podcast. I'm really happy today to welcome to the show Kurt Cagle. Kurt, he's the editor for The Ontologist. He's the managing editor for the Cagle Report. He's been a technologist for more than 35 years. He's written 25 books. He's been blogging for 20 years. He knows one or two things about AI. So welcome, Kurt. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, Larry. I'm busy in AI land and in the intersection of AI and knowledge graphs, and have been trying to kind of find out where the two meet and otherwise contribute to one another. I do run a small consulting company. I have a Calendly account if someone wants to contact me directly for setting up an open office hour, and always looking for opportunities. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cool. Well, and speaking of opportunities, like we met through the knowledge graph community, and I've been involved with for a few years now. And I've been, as the LLM explosion of the last year has come along, I've been like, where's the connection between these? And all of a sudden, the last, few weeks, it almost seems like we're recording this on November 7th, just for people's reference, because you need kind of an anchor in this rapidly changing thing. This episode probably won't air for a couple more weeks, but we're recording this on November 7th, and just either today or yesterday, OpenAI announced a bunch of new product features in the next that include integrations of chat agents and knowledge graph stuff, as well as some other stuff. Can you give us like a quick overview of that big product announcement that just dropped?
Yeah, it was huge. It's quite honestly, if you're involved in the AI space and have already put something together into a product. Yet the announcement of a couple of days ago probably has completely upended any apple cart that you might actually have. There's a whole lot that goes in. Better performance, much bigger context, which is essentially how much information you can send over the wire and how much you can actually refer back to. There is pulling this up, so if it looks like I'm looking off into the space here, I am. But a whole new assistance API, new integration with retrieval, what are called RAGs, and code interpreting. So you can actually define function calls. It now incorporates GPT-4 vision so that you can effectively put up an image and say, what is this? Or, even here's an invoice, do something with it. It has a new text-to-speech module, which is kind of cool. I'm still playing with that one. And then a lot of business-esque things, making it cheaper to use, cheaper to modify, cheaper in general. I think a lot of people were kind of going, this is too expensive. We need to be able to pull things down. And that was the bulk of it. I mean, there's some other things, improvement with Dolly, which is their vision, or excuse me, their image rendering API. And anyway, I've been having some fun just playing with that for producing surprisingly good images. Uh, but overall, what you're seeing with this is essentially a shift away from here's a single product to here's something that is intended to be much more fully integrated. There's a new multimodal uh, modality that is also associated with this that allows you to integrate what had been largely separate plugins into a single framework. So you can load in files, you can you know create files, you know, really get access to any kind of information that you're looking for and do things to manipulate it. It's a really, really cool piece. And
Interesting.
it's also causing a lot of problems with other companies that are now going, oh, this is going to be so fun.
Well, it sounds like they're trying to become like the one-stop shopping solution for all of your. Is it mostly about generative AI? I was trying to listen to all the stuff you said. It sounds like it's mostly generative AI stuff.
It's mostly generative. I mean, admittedly, you know, most of what OpenAI is currently concentrating on is generative. There's some agents and agent technology that's coming in that kind of is along the edge of that and gets more into you know, how do you build companions? How do you build avatars? How do you integrate? And to a significant extent, it's what it does is it raises the bar. There are others playing in the space like Hugging Face, like Google, you know, like Amazon. And, you know, it was very definitely a shot across the bow that says, okay, you know, you need to be able to match this at a minimum.
Yep. So we're going to be facing that for a while. One thing that's occurred to me, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, in the 2.5 weeks since I conceived of and started this podcast, I first thought of it as like mostly sharing information so that people could use this technology better. But I've talked to a number of friends already just in the last few days who work at big enterprises and big tech companies who are doing product content work on these tools themselves. Like, can't say which companies they're at, but there are things like I haven't talked to anybody at OpenAI, but I have talked to people at similar companies doing similar things. Do you have a feel for like what it's like to be like a product person or a designer or an engineer working on these teams that are creating these new AI products? Like all the stuff that went into this announcement we just covered.
Yeah, they're not sleeping. I mean, there's nobody is sleeping at this point, which is a little scary. Um, Realistically, you know, this industry tends to go in waves where you'll have nothing and nothing and nothing. Then all of a sudden you get a whole bunch of announcements at once and you know, a paradigm shift that occurs in how things get done. You know, the last major one that I can really think of was probably Hadoop. And that well, Hadoop and then the machine learning, data learning, or data science development. Before that, it was the rise of mobile phones. And in each of those cases, um, you know, it there was something of a mania aspect to it. You know, people basically trying to get something up there, hoping it sticks and hoping that someone else doesn't come in. I cannot remember ever seeing it moving so fast that you're literally having to wake up in the morning to spend an hour just kind of keeping track of what happened overnight. Um, and you know, then you know, to take that and put it in sense and you know, be able to play with it. Um, so it's a challenge for a lot of people because it means that um, there's a lot of people that are playing with it, a lot of people that are looking at it from a business perspective or a use case perspective, that are fascinated by what they see, can see potential, but they're also in some respects, I think they're afraid to necessarily push too far or too fast, simply because things seem to still be moving. As I put it, it's kind of like, building a luxury hotel on top of quicksand in an earthquake zone. Things will change. It's guaranteed that things will change. And when it does, you just hope that you have slightly more firm quicksand than your competitor down the road.
Wow, that is some scary context for this, but I think people can relate to that. That's kind of how it's felt, like we're all kind of quivering in the quicksand, trying to figure out what the heck's going on. One thing, we had a preliminary chat about this last week, and I'm really glad we didn't record then, because now we got to break this news about the OpenAI announcement. But one of the things we talked about then was it's kind of addressed in this stuff we just reported, the kind of looming, the need for orchestration around this stuff. Like, there's many different technologies and capabilities at play here. The top level stuff that we've talked about, like the LLMs and the knowledge graph stuff working together. Can you talk a little bit about, like, I don't know, it's like, I don't know how high concept you can go about just how that orchestration could and should happen.
Well, I think that what is happening right now is that what's emerging among the different players is essentially a fairly broad agreement about the architecture, about how you build large language models, how you build community language models, which are, in my mind, much more interesting, but it's generally usually smaller and more focused. And so, because of that, you're not at a point where any one given company is essentially driving everything. Instead, you've got about 5 or 6 different companies that are. I guess the best analogy would be, you put half a dozen senior architects into a room, and then handed off Red Bull to each one of them and said, "Okay, whiteboard." And that's what's happening. It's kind of like people are putting stuff up, they're testing it, they're trying to break things down, in terms of, well, does this work here? Does this work there? There's 2 or 3 competitive strains, but it's surprisingly, for the level of sophistication involved with these interfaces, it's going pretty well. I think one of the things that's changed, and it's changed for me, it's changed for the better, is we've gone from this notion of saying we have one single large monolithic model, which was essentially the ChatGPT model. And there were variants, but they were variants, largely by the same company, OpenAI. And that kind of changed around the time that Meta got involved with this. And, arguably what Meta has been doing is kind of pushing some of this back out into the open source community. And because it goes into the open source community, it's suddenly being seen by a lot of other people who are also coming to the table and saying, yeah, but what about this problem? But what about this idea? How can we integrate that? And as a consequence, it also means that, for those people who are trying to keep on top of it, and, both to report and to build on, there's a huge amount of experimentation going on right now that ordinarily would be a lot slower and would be a lot more measured in terms of how things are going. That in turn means that, pluses and minuses. On the minus side, there are still some huge issues, even technical issues that I don't think have been fully addressed yet, have been fully solved yet. But a lot of it has, and the stuff that has really has kind of moved into this mode of let's move away from the monolith and towards many smaller GPT-like components that can then communicate with other systems, with knowledge graphs, with documents, with other across traditional relational databases or NoSQL databases. And that process, as it goes on, is kind of democratizing AI. It's putting it into the hands of enough people that it's no one organization that is essentially doing things by fiat. Everything is at least tested within the broader community to be able to say, does this work? Is this feasible? Is this a bad idea or not?
That's really interesting because
Yeah.
I just want to say, like, companies like Meta are not like kind of pros and cons of them, but one thing they've been good at, like the React framework for for website front ends, and they've open sourced a lot of stuff like it. And now with the open sourcing of their Llama and I don't, there's probably a whole bunch of stuff that they've open sourced. Is it the open source that's making it more, that's leading to the democratization, or is it just the rooms full of engineers with whiteboards and in cases of Red Bull everywhere that's driving that?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think part of it, I didn't have the same attitude towards Meta, as I do, because I'd been involved with, early on with some of the things that were working on the metaverse side. And, the kind of things that were happening out of that was kind of cringeworthy, to say the least. But in this particular case, I think that they realized that they could not necessarily compete in terms of technology or market presence. And so what they did was to say, well, let's essentially go and release some of that into the broader community. How big that community is, I honestly don't think anybody knows. It's still largely concentrated along the West Coast, Seattle, Portland, San Jose, and so that axis seems to be really where a lot of the newer AI work is going on. And which is a little bit different. If you look at semantics is largely East Coast. It's Boston and New York and that area, and it's much more symbolic in terms of the underlying AI models, and that also kind of means that as a consequence, there's still kind of a not invented here attitude that hasn't been completely resolved yet. But it's getting there. It's kind of gotten to the point where people are saying, wait, there is already existing technology that's doing what you're trying to build something to do. And we don't want another Hadoop. We don't want another system where we start with a really cool idea and turn it into a really bad database. A lot of people have learned their lesson after that one. So, is it truly democratized? Yeah, I don't know yet. I think that's still a hard question to answer, but it's more open now than I think a lot of other initiatives are in the IT space.
Like that we're at a similar point in their evolution. It feels more. Yeah, that's good to hear. Hey, I could nerd out on the business and or architectural part of this forever, but I was really taken by some of the stuff we talked about last week, and I want to make sure we get in the sort of like I characterized a part of our conversation from last week as like the Mad Libs part, the filling in the words. I'm dying for you to share the story of Tangled, the Disney movie, and the character in there and how that relates to LLMs. and then talk about like sort of an analogous thing that you talked about with knowledge graphs. I don't want to give.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to spoil your story here, but setting it up.
Oh, well, I'll spoil it on my own, I guess. But in this particular case, it's kind of a way of thinking about what's happening. One of the problems that a lot of people look at when they look at LLMs, and I think this is slowly changing, but not really fast enough, is they look at this and say, well, it's basically kind of a probabilistic way of dealing with language problems, and there really is no intelligence there. And the answer is not really that's not really the case. There's actually some very significant thinking about the nature of how do we think, and how does that translate into neural networks, and what needs to happen to do this. And so when you look at the way that a typical LLM works, it essentially is a text processor. It tokenizes text, your content, and says, I'm going to take this information, I'm going to turn it into a sequence of characters with occasional unknown points or undeclared points that we'll call variables. And those variables are holes that you have in this make up templates. And so, a good example of this is that if you look at the movie Tangled, the first movie, there's a sequence where Anna, the princess, is talking to Hans, who's the prince from another island or set of islands, putatively Denmark. And her interest is essentially in finding connections and finding people. She's lonely. She wants to fall in love, and handsome guy comes along, and his own motivations are a little more shady. But in there's this great assumption where they start into the libretto, and the character Hans sings, we finish each other's, and at that point, Anna comes back and says, sandwiches. Now, that's kind of the way that an LLM works. It kind of looks along this string and says, okay, I've got a set of sequences, or a sequence of tokens that I'm working with, and I've got a certain token in here that would normally say sentences, because sentences kind of is the way you would tend to think about that information. But because there's a very small probability, or had been up until that point, that someone would say something else, there's essentially a chance that that could be something else, and that is what gets substituted into the thing. So there's certain probabilities that you have for this thing to happen. Now, in language, when we are talking about expressions of sequences, those chances can be thought of as, okay, these sequences basically have some kind of an identity that you can assign to, but they evolve, they change over time. And as they do, as something like Tangled comes along, people basically start hearing the libretto, start thinking, oh, that's kind of cute. Everything is now ending with sandwiches instead of sentences. And that probability begins to rise. And it is that probability, that weight, that's assigned to these variables and the tokenized sequences that you're talking about, that ultimately determine how the next set of sequences get interpreted. So that essentially, that filling in of the blank is essentially the way that language models work. It's also sort of kind of the same way that in the semantics world, in the knowledge graph world, the way that you query against a knowledge graph is to do something very similar. You say, I have unknowns, and those unknowns can effectively take many values. And when I make a call against that, I get a setback of all of the phrases and the associated values that come in for those variables that can then be used to determine, well, what concepts am I passing back to the user? Once I have that back, I can then take that information and I can say, here's the context, gives me what's happening at the time. Here's the variables. We're going to then pass this on to a transformer, which will take this information, templatize it, and produce some output. Now, where things have been evolving so rapidly is that the context can then be used, which is the prompt, essentially, or prompt plus a few things, is what can then be used to determine what kind of form that output comes from, what gets generated. And so it could be something that's very simple. It could be something where you're talking, here's information that's appropriate to a 6-year-old versus here's something that's appropriate to a postgraduate student. And the way that you can then pass that information in is to be able to pull from that context enough information to identify what templates you're going to be able to utilize, and then kind of using the same method to build out those templates and then pass them along to the end user.
That's it. As you talk
Now,
about this, I'm reminded of that in both cases, in both an LLM, the data that's working with, and in a knowledge graph, the data instances that populate a knowledge graph, they're both like tokenized or embedded. Actually, let me clarify some language around tokens and tokenization and embedding. Are those similar things? Because the way you hear them in like media reports, you'd think they're very similar, or how do they differ if they do?
They're a little different in that a token is basically just a word or a phrase. It can be other things, but in general, it's essentially a unit of meaning. And the tokens themselves essentially are then used to determine, a vector, which is very big in terms of being able to say, okay, I've got 10,000 different tokens that are in this vector. And I want to be able to find other vectors that are close to that to be able to make, to determine, what other things are similar to that, to be able to then come back and say, here's that set of information that we were talking about. So it's not just a matter of saying, do I have exact matches? It's if I was to create an information space in, say, 10,000 dimensions, where each dimension essentially it was what's called a feature set or a feature. Each feature can have a value that essentially is defined through through that mechanism. To vary between like a value of 0 and 1. And then the interpretation of that 0 and 1 is something that's then kind of kept in the background. These are actually internally, they're kept in what's called a vector graph, or it can be a vector database, just like we're talking about knowledge graphs and graph databases that hold information that way. And these are a little bit different than when we talk about when we talk about like a relational database. A graph database essentially describes graphs or connections of things to other things. And that graph can be very large. It can be some kind of a subgraph that says, okay, from this large set, let's take smaller pieces that all satisfy a given query, or it can be a vector in this case, which essentially is just that. It's one very long array of values for each different feature that can then be used to calculate similarities. And that's kind of where architecture in general is moving. It's kind of a mix of there's some kind of a relational system for relating logically relating content, and there is a search system that's looking towards clustering and similarity of concepts that way. Because of that, it in turn means that you're trying to do the same thing in both cases. You're looking for those things, that set of information that satisfies this and that can then be transformed to something useful. But it's very different from typical relational databases or even NoSQL databases in that it's not just a matter of saying, here's a key, pull back something. It's here's a really long, complex key, find things that are close to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that's helped me, the thing that's helped me understand that one best is the example that comes up a lot of like, you take high level royalty, subtract gender, add another gender, and you go from king to queen. Is that sort of, is that a good example?
Well, that's a good of how a semantic system works. Because there you're saying I have a concept and that concept has these constraints. In this case, high level royalty and has a gender that satisfies male or female. With a vector database, on the other hand, what you're doing is essentially specifying an information space. And, when you pull information from that vector diagram, it really doesn't look like anything that's really useful. This is one of the problems that you run into with AI, is that it's very difficult looking at these, vast sequences of essentially numbers from 0 to 1, and just enough of the labeling to be able to say, okay, this is this particular piece and so forth. But its purpose isn't so much to be able to calculate, to be able to retrieve content, as it is to calculate similarity.
Got it.
Yeah, how are things related to one another?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting to me is like there's a couple things about this that are really, really super interesting. I think to my folks is that one, that leap from, because I think we've all been working mostly like the extent that content design and content engineers and stuff, we've been working mostly with relational databases over the years, which are really, to grossly oversimplify, just a bunch of tables. And we almost always prototype everything in a spreadsheet. So we're kind of on familiar terrain all the way through that whole thing. Now we're jumping into like 10,000 dimension vector space. And it's like, whoa. So I guess I'm going to have to ask you back. We're running up close to time, but I want to have you back at some point. If you ever come up with a metaphor or some way to ground us in that, to help, especially, like non-technical people, designers, content people, product managers, everybody's going to be wrestling with that. And it's the way you just described it totally makes sense. But I just feel like for the day-to-day of it, we're going to need to figure out, how to just our mental models, aligning our mental models with like what's actually going on in these crazy complex black boxes we're dealing with.
Well, I think that this is one of the areas where the knowledge graph community is kind of coming back and raising their hands and saying, hey guys, we've solved this particular problem. And if you let us play in your sandbox, maybe we can find something that solves this, to be able to handle this so that it's not just a matter of we're going to reinvent everything, even if it's not as efficient. And this kind of gets back to Hadoop again, where Hadoop by itself, nobody uses Hadoop anymore. At least very, very few people do. but it really was responsible for a lot of what we now think of as SaaS, the cloud. Because a lot of the concepts that we need to be developed were people going back and saying, well, okay, you have this and it's okay, but we can do much better than that for this particular sub problem. And if we do that, then we don't need all this complexity over here. We have what we have over here, and it's fine. But we do need to build out something to be able to do it. And so Amazon and AWS and Azure and all of those systems essentially evolved out of the realization that, yes, you do have to have people in different domains working with the same content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where it's getting really exciting to me. And it kind of, we'll have to, I'd love to circle back at some point to the whole orchestration thing. But hey, I need to wrap up now. But before we do, I want to make sure, is there anything last that you want to make sure we share today, or that's just on your mind about AI, especially as it pertains to content these days?
Yeah, it's evolving. It's 3.5 million years ago, and a bunch of apes are looking up, and a volcano is going off in the background, and everyone is saying, "Oh crap!" And because of that, because it's evolving so quickly, I honestly don't think that anybody has a very clear idea about what the space is going to look like a year from now. So the best thing you can do is remain nimble, keep aware of what's going on. Don't get too tied up in any one given technology, but try to stay as current as you can with what's out there, and understand that ultimately, what you're doing will have an influence. I think for like the DAM community as an example, I had a conversation, a couple nights ago, specifically on how DAM is going to be influenced. Digital asset management is going to be influenced by AI, and it changes everything. But it also is something where if I had to say exactly how, I think my guess is as good as yours.
I think sorry, my brain just I haven't played a lot with Midjourney and DALL-E and those things, but I'm going to go play with them. And this may be the illustration for this episode of the podcast, like scared apes in a volcano, trying to figure out, in a crystal ball peering into the future. I think the way you just set this up like that, we're all, we're at the beginning of a long evolutionary process. And
don't forget the big black rectangular prism floating in the background, and the ape with the bone. If you're going to do it,
I'll do it right.
Let's get a little Stanley Kubrick into it just for the grins.
That's funny. I was just having, Stanley Kubrick came up early in the day for me. That's weird that he came up twice in one day. But anyhow, well, thank you so much, Kurt. Oh, hey, one very last thing. What's the best way for folks? You mentioned earlier your Calendly thing, but if folks just want to follow you on LinkedIn or connect, what's the best way to connect?
I'm linkedin.com/in/Kurt Cagle, all one word. The Calendly account I mentioned earlier, and then you can get me at kurt.cagle@gmail.com. Generally, LinkedIn is probably the best way of getting a hold of me. But I do have open office hours where I'll take anyone coming in. Just connect with the Calendly and set up a time, and we'll try anyway to get you on the calendar and we can talk.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Larry.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at contentandai.com. And please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.